A man collapses on the floor of his study in Croisset on a May morning in 1880, surrounded by the manuscripts and research notes that had consumed the last decade of his life, and by the time the doctor arrives, Gustave Flaubert is already dead. He's 58 years old. The book on his desk is unfinished. It had been unfinished for years, and it would stay that way. This is the story of how a doctor's son from Rouen became the writer who taught the novel what it was capable of, and then died before he could see what that meant. Rouen, in 1821, was a prosperous city on the Seine, roughly 100 miles from Paris, the kind of place where a man of ambition could build a serious career without leaving Normandy. Achille Cléophas Flaubert had done exactly that. He was the chief surgeon at the Hôtel Dieu, the main hospital of the city, a position of real authority and considerable respect. His family lived on the hospital grounds. This was not unusual for the time. It was practical, efficient, and completely ordinary to the people who lived it. On December 12th, 1821, Gustave Flaubert was born there, the fourth child, in a household where medicine was the language everyone spoke. The house sat at the edge of the hospital complex. The dissection amphitheatre was just beyond the garden wall. Gustave and his younger sister Caroline could climb the trellis along that wall and look down into the room where their father worked. They did this. He wrote about it later, clearly, without drama, as though describing a walk in the countryside. The sun came through the windows of the amphitheatre. The same flies that crossed the garden flew in and settled on the bodies. His father would glance up from his work and tell them to go away. They went away and came back. This was childhood at the Hôtel Dieu. What does it do to a child growing up at that particular edge? The suffering was not abstract. It was not something discussed at dinner and then set aside. It was present, visible, just past the garden. Flaubert wrote later that he had grown up surrounded by all of human misery, separated from it only by a wall. He had the look, he said, of both death and cynicism. That sounds like something a writer says about himself in retrospect, but the facts support it. He was a sensitive child in a house where sensitivity was not especially encouraged, watching a world of pain being managed, catalogued, and cut open by a man who was very good at his job. His father was stern and capable. His mother, Anne-Justine Caroline Fleuriot, was more anxious, more emotionally present, and somewhat fragile. The older brother, Achille, was 9 years older than Gustave and took after their father. He would become a surgeon. He and Gustave were never close. The relationship that shaped Gustave most in his early years was with Caroline, his younger sister, and with Julie, the family servant who had been hired when Gustave was 3 years old, and who would remain with the family until her death in 1883, outliving everyone. Julie raised him, in the practical sense of the word. She managed the daily life of the household, and she was the constant presence while his father operated and his mother worried. She appears in the background of the childhood years, steady and unremarkable, which is exactly why she mattered. 40 years later, Flaubert would write a story about a servant woman named Félicité, whose quiet devotion to a family is rendered without condescension and without sentimentality. Julie was somewhere in that. He read constantly, books were expensive, and the ones in the household were carefully chosen. There was religious instruction, classical literature, history. He absorbed all of it with the focused attention of a child who has already understood, at some level, that observation is his particular gift. He was not especially robust. He was quieter than his age suggested he should be. He spent long hours indoors while other children did not. This was partly temperament, partly the example of a household where intellectual work was the highest thing a person could do. What the hospital gave him was harder to name but impossible to miss. Science in that house meant looking at things as they actually were. His father had no use for comfortable fictions about the body. When someone came to the Hôtel Dieu, the surgeon's job was to see clearly, to cut precisely, to describe what was there rather than what one wished was there. Gustave grew up watching this. He grew up understanding that the comfortable version of things was not the useful version. That sentiment was not the same as accuracy. That a clean sentence and a clean incision had something in common. He was a child who felt things intensely and had learned early to keep that intensity at a certain distance from the world. Not to suppress it, to convert it. The hospital taught observation. The family taught discipline. The books gave him language. Caroline, climbing the trellis beside him, gave him a companion for the watching. He would lose her eventually. He would lose almost everyone. But in the early years at Rouen, the losses were still ahead, and what remained was the view from the garden wall and the certainty, growing stronger every year, that he was meant to record what he saw, rather than become part of it. The boy who grew up watching surgeons cut into human bodies through a garden window would spend the rest of his life cutting into human souls with the same cold precision. And he was barely 10 years old when he started writing it all down. He was 9 or 10 years old when he started writing plays for the family to perform. That is the kind of detail that sounds charming until you realize he never really stopped. He just traded the family audience for the whole of France. The plays came first, short pieces performed in the family billiard room, with his sister Caroline and the servant Julie as cast and audience. They were comedies mostly, drawing on whatever Gustave had been reading that week. That was already more than most adults read in a year. He loved history, loved the medieval, loved anything with enough distance from the present to feel genuinely strange. The hospital world his father ruled was relentlessly concrete. Bodies, instruments, diagnoses, outcomes. The boy writing plays in the billiard room was reaching for something else, something that couldn't be weighed or measured or cut open, to see how it worked. When he entered the Collège Royal in Rouen, the direction he was already moving in found a name. His history teacher was a young man named Adolphe Cheruel, recently arrived and burning with enthusiasm for his subject. Cheruel wasn't interested in dates as a form of punishment. He taught history as something that had actually happened to actual people. That sounds obvious, but wasn't, not in the way he did it. He brought the medieval and the Renaissance into the classroom with a specificity that made them feel close. Flaubert responded to this the way a dry field responds to rain. He began writing historical stories almost immediately, drawing directly from Cheruel's lessons, setting scenes in periods that felt vivid and foreign and far enough from Rouen to breathe. This was the pattern that would define his entire working life, though he didn't know it yet. Find a world remote enough to see clearly. Research it until it becomes real, then write it so that the reader cannot look away. At 12 and 13, he was doing a primitive version of exactly that, producing stories about medieval subjects with the focused intensity of someone twice his age. In 1837, when Flaubert was 15, one of his pieces appeared in a small Rouen literary journal called Le Colibri. It wasn't a major publication. Nobody outside the city noticed, but it was print, his words on a page that existed independently of him. He understood what that meant. He had already decided that writing was not a hobby. It was the thing itself. Everything else was distraction. His father had other expectations. Achille Cléophas Flaubert was a surgeon of real distinction, head of the Hôtel Dieu, a man who had built something through discipline and precision and the application of trained intelligence to concrete problems. He wanted his sons to be professionals. His older son, Achille, was already being shaped toward medicine. For Gustave, the law seemed likely, a respectable path for a boy who clearly wasn't suited to surgery. The elder Flaubert was not unsympathetic to his younger son's peculiarities, but he understood the world in terms of what it required from people who wanted to live in it securely. What it required did not include becoming a writer. Gustave understood this. He also understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who has never seriously entertained another option, that it didn't matter. Around this time he came into contact with Alfred Le Poitevin, a friend from school who was several years older and who carried his intellectual seriousness like a physical characteristic. Le Poitevin was drawn to philosophy in the most uncompromising way, not as a subject to study, but as a set of conclusions about existence that had to be lived with honestly. His worldview was dark. He believed that human life was essentially futile, that suffering was the primary condition, that most people spent their time constructing illusions to avoid looking directly at what was actually true. He was not cheerful company. He was exactly what Flaubert needed. The pessimism Le Poitevin offered wasn't despair. It was a kind of clarity. If you stripped away the comfortable assumptions, if you looked at experience without flinching, what you found wasn't nothing, it was material. Everything that people preferred not to examine directly became, for the writer willing to examine it, the most honest subject available. Flaubert absorbed this with the enthusiasm of someone who had been half thinking it already and now had a framework to hang it on. The two young men talked for hours about literature and philosophy and the problem of existence. The conversations left a permanent mark. What was taking shape in Flaubert during these years at the Collège Royal was not a personality exactly. The personality was already there. Fully formed and somewhat unyielding, but a set of convictions about what writing was for. It was not for comfort. It was not for instruction. It was not for the reader's easy pleasure or the writer's self-expression in any simple sense. It was something harder and more demanding, something that required you to see accurately and then find the exact words for what you saw, to keep working until those words were right. He was 16 when the encounter that would test all of this happened, though he didn't know that's what it was yet. He was in Tréville for the summer with his family. That was where the Flauberts went when his father needed rest from the hospital and his mother needed sea air. By the time Flaubert was 16, he had already completed a manuscript called Mémoire d'un Fou, a thinly disguised account of an obsessive passion for an older married woman he had met on a beach that summer. He had no intention of showing it to anyone. The summer of 1836 produced in Flaubert a wound so precise and so permanent that he would still be writing about it 30 years later without having fully understood what it had done to him. He was 14 years old. His family had travelled to the resort town of Trouville on the Normandy coast. On the beach there he saw a woman named Elisa Schlesinger. She was 26, 11 years his senior, already married to a music publisher named Maurice Schlesinger. By every account extraordinary to look at. Flaubert saw her, and something in him simply stopped. He watched her from a distance for days. He did not speak to her, or not in any way that mattered. He gathered her discarded bathing wrap from the sand one morning and held it. That was the extent of what happened between them that summer. That is to say, that almost nothing happened at all. It consumed him for the rest of his life. What made the Elisa encounter so durable was precisely its incompleteness. There was no rejection to recover from, no rupture to explain. She was married and kind and largely unaware of the intensity directed at her from across the beach. He was a boy. The feeling had nowhere to go. It simply accumulated in him, undischarged, without resolution, like a note held too long in an empty room. He saw her again after that summer. The families had mutual connections, and Flaubert encountered Elisa in Paris in subsequent years. Each meeting renewed the feeling, without advancing it anywhere. He was still young, she was still married. Nothing changed except the depth of the impression she had already made. By the time he was 16, he had written Mémoire d'un Fou. The manuscript he had no intention of showing anyone. It was a thinly veiled account of the whole thing, the beach, the woman, the passion that had nowhere to go. The writing was emotional, overwrought in places, everything his mature prose would eventually discipline itself away from. But the impulse was already there. When experience became unbearable, he converted it into sentences. Mémoire d'un Fou was the first example of a pattern that would define his entire literary life. Flaubert felt things with an intensity that seemed to him incompatible with ordinary living. He watched his own emotions the way his father watched a dissection, closely, without flinching, without intervening. He had the observer's temperament and the participant's capacity for feeling. The combination meant that his most powerful experiences tended to produce manuscripts rather than actions. The feeling was real. What it produced was art. The gap between those two things was where Flaubert lived. This is what made him such a precise anatomist of romantic illusion later on. He understood from the inside what it felt like to construct an imaginary person around an actual one, to take a real woman on a real beach and build from her a cathedral of meaning she had not consented to and would not have recognized. Emma Bovary does something similar, after a fashion. So does Frédéric Moreau in Sentimental Education, the novel he would spend 7 years writing in the 1860s, the one in which the ghost of Elisa finally found its most permanent literary form. Marie Arnoux, the older married woman whom Frédéric loves hopelessly across decades in that novel, was drawn directly from Elisa Schlesinger. The details are not hidden. The circumstances mirror each other closely enough that readers who knew Flaubert understood exactly what they were looking at. 30 years after the beach at Tréville, he was still circling the same experience, still trying to find a form large enough to hold what it had meant. The difference was that by then he had the craft to render it without the adolescent heat. The feeling in Sentimental Education is cold and vast and quietly devastating, precisely because Flaubert had learned to keep himself out of it. He had turned the wound into method. What Sentimental Education understood about that kind of love, the love that never declares itself, that watches from across rooms and across years and never quite crosses into action, is that it persists through the very absence of consummation. There is nothing to exhaust it. It feeds on its own incompleteness. Frédéric carries Marie Arnoux through the entirety of the novel, the way Flaubert carried Elisa through the entirety of his life. Neither the character nor the author ever quite figures out how to put the feeling down. Elisa Schlesinger's husband died in the early 1870s. She was a widow by then, elderly, living in Germany. Flaubert was in his 50s, famous, tired, and in the process of losing nearly everything else he had. He wrote to her. He finally said something of what she had been to him. Whatever she replied, it changed nothing. The feeling had outlasted the youth of both of them and outlasted the conditions under which it might have meant something different. He would not tell her what she had meant to him until she was a widow and he was in his 50s. By then they had both become old. The moment, like so many of the moments in his fiction, had already passed without resolution. In November 1841, Flaubert arrived in Paris to study law, which is to say that he arrived in Paris to be miserable in a new and more expensive city. He was 20 years old and had been carrying the wound from Trouville for 5 years, and had been writing secretly for longer than that. And none of this made him well suited to the faculty of law. His father had decided the matter. Achille Cléophas Flaubert was a practical man who had built a respectable life through medicine, and he saw no reason his younger son could not build something similar through law. Gustave had no counter-argument that his father would accept, so he packed his things and went north. Paris in 1841 was overwhelming in the way that Paris has always been overwhelming. The scale of it, the noise, the constant social performance required simply to exist in the city. Flaubert found none of this energizing. He attended his lectures with the dull compliance of someone performing an obligation. The law itself held no interest for him. The codes and precedents and procedures, the whole architecture of legal reasoning, struck him as exactly the kind of received thinking he had been quietly suspicious of since childhood. He sat in the lecture halls and felt the hours moving slowly. What he did instead of studying law was write, not publicly, not with any intention of showing the work around. He was still treating writing as something shameful and private, a habit he couldn't stop rather than a vocation he had chosen. He worked on fiction, on fragments, on the kind of searching and melodramatic prose that young writers produce when they are trying to figure out what they actually believe. He was not producing anything he thought finished. He was producing the drafts of a sensibility, the one genuine pleasure Paris offered him was the deepening of his friendship with Maxime Duchamp. Duchamp was 20, ambitious, well-connected, and possessed of an almost opposite temperament to Flaubert's, outward-facing, energetic, interested in the world as it actually presented itself. The two young men understood each other across this difference. Duchamp saw in Flaubert a seriousness about literature that he respected. Flaubert found in Duchamp someone who took his ambitions seriously, rather than treating them as an embarrassment. They walked and talked and argued. It was one of those friendships that feels, at 20, like it might organise everything that comes after. The law studies continued without progress. Flaubert passed some examinations, failed to distinguish himself, and spent his real attention elsewhere. He was reading voraciously, the same consuming appetite for books that had characterised him since childhood, now directed by no particular curriculum. He was thinking seriously about what prose could do and what it couldn't. He was also, beneath all of this, beginning to understand that the life his father had mapped out for him was a life he was constitutionally unable to inhabit. He had not yet found a way to say so. Then in January 1844, on a night road near Pont-l'Evêque, everything changed. He was travelling with his brother Achille when the attack came on. It was sudden and violent. His body seized, his vision collapsed, and for a period he had no control over anything at all. When it was over, he was left shaken in a way that went beyond the physical. He had not known the body could do that without warning. He had not known the ground could disappear. More attacks followed. The diagnosis, when it came, described a nervous condition resembling epilepsy, though the doctors were careful about the exact term. His father, the surgeon, understood what this meant practically. Travel was dangerous. Stress was dangerous. The social world of a working lawyer, with its demands and unpredictabilities, was dangerous. The life Flaubert had been pointed toward began to look medically inadvisable. There is something almost too convenient about this, and Flaubert himself seems to have understood it. The illness was real. The seizures were terrifying, and they would recur throughout his life. But it also arrived at precisely the moment when he needed an exit that his father could accept. A young man who simply refused to practice law because he wanted to write novels was one kind of problem. A young man with a serious neurological condition was another kind entirely. Achille Cleophas was a doctor. He could not argue with the body's evidence. The law studies ended. The path to a conventional professional life closed. Flaubert returned to Rouen, to the family house at Croisset on the Seine, and the question of what he was going to do with his life resolved itself. Not through decision exactly, but through elimination. He was going to write. There was nothing else left that was possible. The philosophical shift that followed was not immediate. It accumulated. He began to understand the illness as something that had declared his nature more clearly than he had been able to declare it himself. He was an observer. He was someone who watched life rather than entered it, who converted experience into prose rather than into action. The seizures had confirmed this at the level of the body. They had made ordinary participation genuinely risky. And so he stopped fighting the temperament he had always had. The attacks kept coming, and each time they came, the distance between Flaubert and the ordinary life he had been expected to live grew a little wider, and after a while, the distance became so great that even he stopped pretending to close it. His father died in January 1846. 9 weeks later, his sister Caroline died, giving birth to a daughter. Flaubert, 24 years old, and suddenly hollowed out by back-to-back grief, withdrew to the family property at Croisset and essentially never left. The two deaths came so close together that there was almost no room between them for grief to organise itself. Achille Cleophas Flaubert had been the fixed point of the family, the surgeon, the patriarch, the man whose professional reputation had defined what the Flauberts were. He died in January from an abscess that turned septic. That is the kind of death a surgeon's family understands with particular horror. His son had not yet processed that loss when Caroline went into labour in March, and did not survive it. She was 21 years old. The infant daughter lived. Flaubert's mother, who had already spent weeks nursing her husband toward death, now buried her only daughter. The household at Rouen, which had always organised itself around Achille Cléophas and his work, suddenly had no centre. Flaubert made a decision. He gathered his mother and his newborn niece and moved them all to Croisset. Croisset was a small estate on the Seine, roughly 5 kilometres west of Rouen. It had been in the family's possession for several years. The house sat directly above the river. From the upper windows you could watch the boats moving downstream toward the sea. The property was not grand. It was comfortable, provincial, the kind of place that suggested a prosperous family without announcing wealth. But Flaubert transformed one room of it into something that would become almost mythological among the writers who came after him. His study faced the water. It was white, the walls, the curtains, the desk itself pale in the lamplight, and he worked there through the night, often until dawn, in a silence broken only by the river traffic and the occasional shout of a passing sailor. He kept a bell on the desk to ring for coffee. He rang it often. The inheritance his father left was substantial enough to make ordinary employment unnecessary. This mattered enormously. The seizures that had ended his law studies had already closed off one version of his life. The money closed off the need to find another. He would not have to practice a profession. He would not have to teach or clerk or enter commerce. He could simply write, if writing was what he chose. And at Croisset, insulated from Paris, insulated from the social machinery that consumed most literary lives of the period, he chose it with the finality of someone who had run out of alternatives. How does grief become a condition for work? It's not the obvious question, but it's the one Croisset raises. Flaubert had lost the two people, outside his mother, who had mattered most to him. His father's death removed an authority he had never fully reconciled himself with. A brilliant, demanding man who had expected his son to enter a respectable profession and watched him collapse instead into nervous illness and prose. Caroline's death removed something else, something warmer. She had been his audience, his companion, the person he had watched corpses with from the garden window as a child. Her absence left a particular kind of silence, and into that silence Flaubert placed his desk. He was not immediately productive. Grief doesn't work on a schedule. In the months after the deaths, he read, he corresponded, he kept to the house. His mother was present, but the household was subdued. The infant niece, also named Caroline, after her dead mother, required attention. The practical administration of the estate required attention. Flaubert dealt with all of it, and kept returning to his white study, and his bell, and the river outside the window. Croisset was becoming the shape of his life, not a retreat exactly, more like a position he had taken. Then in July 1846, 6 months after his father's death, and 4 months after Caroline's, Flaubert travelled to Paris. He had gone to commission a bust of his dead sister from the sculptor James Pradier. That is the kind of errand that tells you everything about where his mind was at that point. He was still in mourning. He was still organising his grief into acts of preservation. At Pradier's studio, there were other visitors. One of them was a woman named Louise Colet. She was 36 years old to his 25. She was a poet with a genuine reputation, a presence in Parisian literary circles. By all accounts, a striking woman. She was posing for Pradier when Flaubert arrived. The encounter was brief, electric, the beginning of something Flaubert would spend the next 9 years managing poorly. They met twice more before he returned to Croisset. Letters followed, then more letters. Then the letters became, without quite announcing themselves as such, a correspondence that would eventually fill volumes and document in extraordinary detail the emergence of a major writer's aesthetic philosophy, though neither of them framed it that way at the time. What Flaubert took back to Croisset from that Paris visit was not exactly comfort. Louise Colet was not a comfortable woman, and she had not chosen a comfortable man. What she had chosen, though she could not yet know it fully, was a man who was going to conduct their entire relationship primarily through the written word. From a house on the Seine he could not be persuaded to leave, in letters that discussed prose rhythm as often as they discussed her. He was 24 years old, his father was dead, his sister was dead. He had an infant niece to help raise, a mother to keep, a riverbank estate to maintain, a poet named Louise Colet who had just looked at him from across a sculptor's studio in a way that made everything more complicated. Louise Colet was a celebrated poet, a well-known beauty, 36 years old to his 25, and the first letter Flaubert sent her after their meeting included a detailed critique of one of her poems, which tells you more about the relationship than most love letters ever could. They had met in July 1846 at the Paris studio of the sculptor James Pradier, where Colet was posing for a bust. Flaubert had come to commission a portrait of his dead sister, Caroline. He was 24 years old, recently bereaved, and already withdrawing from the world. She was established, admired, and married, though the marriage was a formality. The attraction was immediate and mutual. Within days they were lovers. Within weeks Flaubert was back at Croisset, and the letters had begun. The geography of the affair was the affair. Flaubert would not leave Normandy. He had settled into Croisset with a deliberateness that was more than grief, more than circumstance. The house was where he worked. The work was the point. Colet lived in Paris, where her life and reputation were anchored, and the distance between them was not incidental. It was structural. It was, from Flaubert's side, almost preferred. He came to Paris occasionally, weeks or months apart, and in between there were the letters. 281 of them survive from his hand. They are extraordinary documents, not because they describe the progress of a love affair, though they do that too, but because they describe in real time a writer assembling his beliefs about what literature is supposed to be. Flaubert was 25 when the correspondence began, and he had not yet written the work that would define him. He was still becoming the writer who would spend 5 years on a single novel, and the letters to Colet are where that writer first speaks clearly. He wrote to her about the sentence. He wrote obsessively, almost maniacally, about the difficulty of prose. A single page could take him a week. A single paragraph could consume 3 days of drafts and revisions, and readings aloud in the room he used as a testing chamber, where he would shout sentences at the walls to hear how they landed. He had a specific phrase for what he was pursuing. Le mot juste, the right word. Not a good word, not an adequate word, but the one word that was exactly correct, that could not be replaced or moved without damage to the whole. He believed this with the conviction of a man who had organized his life around it. In one letter, he described the experience of working on a single passage until he could no longer read it clearly. His head reeled, he wrote. His throat ached from the efforts of bellowing the same sentence in 100 different forms, groping towards something he could feel the shape of but not yet reach. He compared the work to digging towards something buried, unsure of the depth. What he was doing in these letters was not complaining. He was thinking out loud. Colet was his audience. She was brilliant enough to follow him and close enough to him that he did not have to perform. The letters are what a writer sounds like when he trusts someone enough to say what he actually thinks. What he thought, fundamentally, was that style was not decoration. It was structure. The right sentence was not a sentence that said the right thing beautifully. It was a sentence where sound and meaning had become the same thing, where the rhythm of the words was inseparable from what those words were doing. He believed this kind of writing required the total suppression of the author's personality. The writer had no business inserting his feelings into the work. The novel was not a confession, it was a made object, as deliberately constructed as a piece of architecture. Colet did not always find this easy to receive. She was a romantic in temperament and a poet by practice, and she wrote from feeling. She believed that literature expressed the self. Flaubert was arguing, letter by letter, that the self had to be erased. These were not compatible positions, and they were not confined to aesthetics. She wanted more of him. He gave her letters about prose rhythm. She travelled to Croisset unannounced on at least one occasion. He did not encourage this. The silences between letters stretched. The arguments grew sharper. There was genuine feeling in the relationship. That should be said. The letters are not cold. They are full of longing and physical memory, and something that resembles love in most of its important features. But Flaubert's emotional life operated at a remove he could not close and possibly did not want to. He had watched his father die and his sister die within 9 weeks of each other. He had withdrawn to a house by a river and built his days around a desk. The disorder that comes with being fully present in a relationship, the demands, the spontaneity, the intrusions on concentration, was not something he could accommodate without losing something he valued more. He was honest about this in his way. The honesty did not make Colet feel better. The affair ran on, with interruptions and reconciliations, until 1855. 9 years if you count from the beginning. The arguments that ended it were about the usual things: her jealousy, his distance, the accumulation of small failures on both sides. By then, Flaubert was deep into Madame Bovary. He had been writing it for 4 years. He needed silence, and he needed the desk, and he needed the gouloir, and he needed the conviction that the sentence he was struggling with was worth the struggle. And the relationship had become another demand on an attention he could not divide. When they finally broke off for good in 1855, Colet was furious, and Flaubert was, by most accounts, relieved. And the 281 letters he had written, her remained, which is perhaps the most Flaubertian outcome imaginable, the correspondence outlasting the feeling it was supposed to express. In September 1849, Flaubert finished reading the first version of The Temptation of St. Anthony, aloud to his 2 closest friends, over the course of 4 days. He had been working on it for years, and was convinced it was extraordinary, and when he finally stopped, they told him to throw the manuscript in the fire. The 2 friends were Maxime Ducamp and Louis Bouillet. They had listened without interruption, as Flaubert had demanded, through the entire thing. Then they delivered their verdict. The subject was wrong, the approach was wrong, the whole fantastical project was a mistake. Stop writing about saints and visions and medieval mysticism. Write about real life. Write about people who actually exist. Flaubert had poured years into this work. He had believed it was his breakthrough. The gap between what he expected to hear and what he actually heard was enormous. It hit him accordingly. He had been drawn to the subject since 1838. When he saw a Bruegel painting depicting the temptations of St. Anthony and felt something ignite in him, the idea had been growing for over a decade. Anthony in the desert, assaulted by visions, by demons, by the whole chaotic spectacle of human belief and delusion. It was exactly the kind of grand, sweeping philosophical canvas that appealed to the part of Flaubert that loved history and excess and the grotesque. He had written it with everything he had. His friends told him it showed. What it showed, they argued, was precisely the problem. The prose was overwrought. The ambition outran the execution. Flaubert was at his most self-indulgent when he was furthest from the observable world. St. Anthony had taken him as far from it as he could get. They were not wrong. He knew they were not wrong, and knowing it did not make the verdict easier to absorb. The Eastern journey followed almost immediately. Ducamp had been planning a trip through the Mediterranean for some time and had secured an official commission from the French government that wanted photographic documentation of archaeological sites in Egypt and the Near East. He invited Flaubert. The timing was either fortunate or deliberate, perhaps both. They left in November 1849, less than 2 months after the St. Anthony reading. They would not return for 20 months. The journey covered Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Turkey, Greece, Cairo and the Nile, Jerusalem, Beirut, Constantinople, which they reached in the spring of 1850. Flaubert kept notebooks throughout. He wrote long letters home to his mother and to Boulez. He described everything: the smell of the markets, the colour of the light on the water, the faces of the people, the texture of ancient stone. In Cairo, he watched dancers perform and recorded what he saw with the same cold attentiveness he brought to everything. He was building a library of sensation, though he did not yet know exactly what he would build with it. Egypt astonished him. The scale of it, the antiquity, the strangeness. He had described ancient landscapes in his early writing, imagined them from books, constructed them from historical sources, and now he was standing inside the reality. It was different from what he had imagined in ways that mattered. The Sphinx was smaller than he expected. The Nile was vaster. The living and the ancient sat beside each other without apparent awareness of the contrast. This was the kind of specific, irreducible detail that no amount of library research could have given him. In Beirut, he contracted syphilis. He was treated more or less, though the treatment in 1850 was mercury. That addressed the immediate symptoms and created its own long-term damage. He noted the fact in his travel journal with his characteristic flatness. It was something that happened. He continued travelling. Constantinople held him for 5 weeks. He wandered the city, attended to its textures, filled more notebooks. He visited a mosque. He watched the street life with the same intense, slightly detached observation he had practiced since childhood. When he had watched the hospital from the garden window, the scale of the Muslim world, the breadth of it, the absolute difference of its organisational assumptions from anything he had grown up with, all of this enlarged something in his understanding of what human life could look like from the outside. Greece came last. He stood at the Acropolis and felt something he found difficult to articulate in his letters. Not the romantic awe he might have expected, but something more disquieting, the sense of a civilization fully present in its ruins and completely inaccessible in its actual lived experience. He would return to this feeling many years later when he wrote Salammbô. The past was real. It was gone, and the gap between those two facts was where his imagination lived. The belief his friends had hammered into him after the St. Anthony reading, right from observation, right from the real world. Accumulate specific sensory detail and let it do the work, was being tested and confirmed everywhere he went. He could see it working. He could feel the difference between the Egypt he had imagined from sources and the Egypt he was standing in. The senses knew things that research alone could not deliver. And research, he was learning, could prepare you to use your senses correctly, to know what you were looking at, to recognise what mattered, but it could not replace the looking. He came back from Egypt and Greece and Syria in the spring of 1851 with notebooks full of detail, a body that carried its own souvenirs from Beirut, the uneasy conviction that his friends had been right about St. Anthony, that it was time to write something entirely different. In the autumn of 1851, Flaubert sat down at his desk in Croisset and began writing a novel about a provincial doctor's wife who reads too many romances and destroys herself trying to make her life match them. It would take him 5 years and nearly 5,000 pages of drafts to get it right. He had come back from Egypt with a body of material and a new discipline. His friends had told him to write about real life. He was going to do exactly that, and the effort nearly destroyed him. The novel was based loosely on a true story, a provincial scandal involving a Norman doctor's wife named Delphine Delamere, who had taken lovers, accumulated debts she couldn't pay, died of poison in 1848. Flaubert knew the outline. He took it and built something else entirely. Emma Bovary is a farmer's daughter educated at a convent, where she read novels full of romantic passion and decided that real life should feel the same way. She marries Charles Bovary, a slow and devoted country doctor who loves her completely and bores her to the point of despair. She takes lovers, She runs up debts buying the beautiful things she believes her life requires. The lovers disappoint her. The debts become catastrophic. At the end, she swallows arsenic and dies in the kind of agony that nothing in her romantic reading had prepared her for. Charles, who never understood her and never stopped loving her, survives only long enough to discover what she had done to their finances, and then dies himself of grief. Flaubert knew this story would work. He also found it almost physically painful to write. The subject matter, the grey Norman countryside, the dull dinner parties, the provincial ambitions and small humiliations, was everything he had spent his life trying to distance himself from. He was forcing himself to look directly at the world he most despised, to render it without flinching and without contempt. That was the harder requirement. He wrote at night in the white study overlooking the Seine. He kept a particular ritual. He would draft a passage, revise it, then carry it to what he called the gouloir, the shouting room, where he read his sentences aloud at full volume, listening for the rhythm. A sentence that sounded wrong was wrong. It didn't matter if the meaning was correct. It didn't matter if the grammar was correct. If the sound was off, the sentence had to go. He threw away enormous quantities of work this way, 5,000 pages of drafts to produce a finished novel of perhaps 400. The ratio tells you something about what he thought writing was. The letters to Louise Colet during these years are documents of genuine suffering. My head reels and my throat aches with chasing after, slogging over, delving into, around, groping after, and bellowing in 100,000 different ways. A sentence that I've at last finished, he wrote to her at one point. He reported spending a full week on a single page. He reported advancing so slowly that the book seemed to have no end. He described the work as a kind of quarry, vast blocks of material to be broken apart, reduced, reshaped, until the shape inside revealed itself. He was not exaggerating. The drafts survive. You can see it happening, sentence by sentence. What made the writing so difficult was not the story, it was the method. Flaubert had decided that the author of a novel must be completely absent from it. No judgments, no commentary, no authorial voice stepping in to tell the reader what to think about Emma's choices, or Charles's blindness, or the mediocrity of the world they inhabited. The facts would be presented with absolute fidelity. The reader would draw their own conclusions. This sounds straightforward. It is not. It requires the writer to carry all of their opinions about everything in the novel, and Flaubert had savage opinions about almost everything in this novel, and to leave every one of those opinions out of the prose entirely. The technical achievement that made this possible was what later critics would call free indirect style. Flaubert had not invented it, but he perfected it. The technique works like this. The narration shifts without announcement, from the objective external view into the subjective interior of a character, then back out again. The reader often cannot say precisely where the line is. We see the world as Emma sees it. We feel what she feels. And simultaneously, because the prose is so precisely calibrated, we can see exactly how Emma's perception distorts reality. We are inside her consciousness and outside it at the same time. We understand her better than she understands herself. This is an extraordinary thing to do with sentences. Flaubert spent 5 years learning how to do it consistently. He was asked later who Emma Bovary was based on. Madame Bovary, c'est moi, he answered. He meant it seriously. The romantic hunger, the refusal to accept the world as it actually is, the fury at the gap between imagination and reality, these were not foreign to him. He had felt all of it. The discipline of his mature style was partly a response to his own capacity for exactly that kind of feeling. He understood Emma from the inside because some part of him was Emma. The cold precision of the prose was the distance he had built between himself and that part. By 1855, when his affair with Colet finally ended, the novel was still not finished. He worked on. The Seine moved past his window, the study filled with drafts. He tested his sentences in the couloir and threw out the ones that failed. He reported his progress in letters to friends, in units of pages so small they seemed almost comical. 3 good pages in a week, 2 pages in 10 days. He did not stop. He did not begin something else. He had decided this was what the rest of his life was for. He was going to finish it properly, or not at all. The manuscript was completed in April 1856. He had written it across 5 years, at a desk overlooking a river, mostly alone, by lamplight. In a discipline so extreme it had cost him his relationship, and very nearly his health. He had read the draft aloud in its entirety to Louis Colet, his most trusted literary friend, made further revisions based on Coulet's response. He had cut passages he loved because they were too obviously beautiful and would have called attention to the prose instead of disappearing into it. He had tested the ending in the couloir until it sat right. Madame Bovary was finished in April 1856, serialized that autumn in La Revue de Paris, with the editors already nervous and cutting scenes they found too explicit. Flaubert, exhausted and quietly certain he had done something unprecedented, waited to see what the world would make of it. On January 31st, 1857, Gustave Flaubert stood trial in Paris for offending public morality with a novel about a bored provincial housewife, which turned out to be the best publicity a book has ever received. The charges were brought by the imperial government, and the prosecutor was a man named Ernest Pinard. His argument was not subtle. Madame Bovary, Pinard contended, glorified adultery. It presented a woman who betrayed her husband repeatedly, accumulated debts through lies and manipulation, and finally poisoned herself. And yet, at no point did the novel step back and condemn her. There was no authorial voice saying that Emma Bovary was wrong. There was no character whose virtue contrasted meaningfully with her corruption. The novel, in Pinard's reading, invited readers to sympathise with an adulteress without ever punishing that sympathy. This was, he argued, a corruption of public morals dressed up as literature. The defence was led by Flaubert's lawyer, Marie-Antoine Jules Senard, and Senard had read the novel carefully. His argument was almost the mirror image of Pinard's. The novel did punish Emma. It destroyed her. Her romantic illusions led her into debt, into degradation, into a death so physically horrible, arsenic poisoning rendered in clinical detail, that no reader could finish the book imagining that Flaubert had endorsed her choices. The prosecution had mistaken the absence of moralizing for the absence of morality. Senard read long passages aloud in court. He pointed to the suffering, the humiliation, the ugliness of Emma's end. The novel was not a celebration, it was a dissection. The court acquitted Flaubert on February 7th. The verdict was careful. The judges noted that the novel contained passages that were, in their view, genuinely objectionable, but not sufficiently so to sustain a criminal conviction. It was an acquittal with reservations, a narrow legal victory rather than a vindication, and Flaubert knew the difference. He had been accused in open court of corrupting France, and the court had declined to imprison him, while making clear it found some of his work distasteful. This was not quite triumph, but the effect on the book was immediate and enormous. The trial had run for weeks. Paris had followed it. The name Madame Bovary had appeared in the newspapers more times than any serialized novel could reasonably hope for, and the people who had not read the installments in La Revue de Paris were now acutely aware that something was happening. When the novel was published as a complete volume in April 1857, it sold out. The first edition was exhausted almost immediately. A second followed. The book that the imperial government had tried to suppress had been made famous by the attempt. Writers recognized it at once. The response among serious readers was not uniform, but it was serious. People understood that the technique was new. Flaubert had written a novel in which the narrator almost never appears, in which the author's judgment is nowhere stated and everywhere implied, in which the reader is placed so completely inside Emma's consciousness that the condemnation, when it comes, arrives through the reader's own dawning comprehension, rather than through any authorial announcement. This was not how novels were supposed to work. Novelists were supposed to guide you. They were supposed to tell you what to think. Flaubert had removed that scaffolding and left you standing inside Emma Bovary's mind, watching her deceive herself, and made you do the moral work yourself. The moralists were hostile. Some critics found the book cold, clinical, without feeling. They were not wrong about the coldness, that was deliberate. They mistook it for a flaw. Others objected on precisely the grounds the prosecution had raised. The novel seemed to them to admire what it portrayed, or at least to refuse to condemn it loudly enough. The argument continued for years. It has not entirely stopped. What did not continue for years was the money. Flaubert made approximately 500 francs from Madame Bovary in its first 5 years of sale. This is a number worth pausing on. He had spent 5 years writing it. He had produced thousands of pages of drafts. He had agonized over individual sentences for days at a stretch, shouting them aloud in the study at Croisset to test their rhythm. The novel was recognized almost immediately as something extraordinary, and the financial return was negligible. He was not a poor man. The inheritance from his father had made that possible. But the book that made him famous made him almost nothing. Decades later, Henry James would read Madame Bovary and understand it as the novel that had taught fiction what it was capable of. James was not given to overstatement. When he wrote about Flaubert, it was with the attention of someone studying a technical revolution, the management of point of view, the suppression of the author, the way the prose inhabited its characters without dissolving into them. James saw all of this as a shift in what the novel could do, a demonstration that fiction could be as formally serious as any art form. Flaubert had shown that the way a thing was written was not separate from what it meant. The same year Madame Bovary appeared as a book, Baudelaire published Les Fleurs du Mal, and the imperial government prosecuted that too. Baudelaire was convicted. 6 poems were suppressed. 2 writers, 2 prosecutions, the same 12 months in Paris. The coincidence is striking and not quite accidental. Something in French literature had shifted, or was trying to shift, and the government could feel it even when the critics couldn't fully name it. The old idea that literature existed to affirm social values was under pressure. What Flaubert had done, and what Baudelaire was doing in verse, was to insist that art answered to something other than public comfort. He had made almost no money. He had been publicly accused of corrupting French society. He had been acquitted on a technicality, and in the same year, Baudelaire had been prosecuted for his poems. And somehow, out of all of this, Flaubert had managed to change what the novel was allowed to be. The first thing Flaubert did after finishing Madame Bovary was travel to Tunisia to research a novel about ancient Carthage. That is either a logical progression or a complete reversal, depending on how you look at it. He had just spent 5 years inside the mind of a provincial doctor's wife in Normandy. The grey skies, the muddy roads, the suffocating smallness of Emma Bovary's world, all of it rendered with the precision of a man who had looked at it until his eyes ached. The acquittal was barely cold. The book was in every Paris shop, and Flaubert was already somewhere else entirely, reading about mercenaries and elephant charges, and a city on the coast of North Africa that had been dead for 2,000 years. This was not an accident. The distance between Rouen and Carthage was, for him, the whole point. He travelled to Tunisia in 1858, the same methodical need for first-hand observation driving him as always. He walked the ground where Carthage had stood. He studied the landscape, the light, the colour of the soil. He read everything he could locate on the Punic Wars, on ancient North African culture, on military tactics of the 3rd century BC. The research was extensive in the way that all his research was extensive, not as background preparation, but as foundation material, the thing the prose would be built on top of. By the time he began writing, he had accumulated the same enormous weight of documented knowledge that had preceded Madame Bovary, applied now to a world that no living person had ever seen. The subject he had chosen was the mercenary revolt against Carthage, a historical conflict that lasted from roughly 240 to 237 BC, in which soldiers hired to fight Carthage's wars turned against the city after being denied their pay. It was a brutal episode: sieges, massacres, calculated atrocities on both sides. At the centre of his novel, Flaubert placed Salammbô, the daughter of the Carthaginian general Hamilcar, a figure with no historical basis, invented entirely to carry the emotional weight of the story. She is a priestess of the goddess Tanit, obsessive and remote, drawn into a terrible entanglement with the mercenary leader Martho. Nothing about her is quite knowable. This was deliberate. The contrast with Bovary could not have been more complete. Where that novel had been grey and precise and stripped almost to transparency, Salammbô was dense with colour, heat, violence, spectacle. The prose was lush in a way that Flaubert's mature style normally refused to be. Battles described in overwhelming sensory detail, religious rituals rendered with a kind of anthropological richness that felt excessive by design. The city of Carthage itself, its temples and gardens and slave markets, rendered as something halfway between historical reconstruction and fever dream. Critics noticed immediately, and not all of them were approving. There were readers who found the whole thing overwrought, too much description, too much exotic accumulation, the narrative drowning in its own ornamentation. Some compared it unfavourably to Bovary, finding the distance from recognisable human psychology disorienting. The mercenaries and priestesses and Carthaginian senators felt to these critics like figures in a frieze rather than characters in a novel, impressive to look at, impossible to inhabit. They were not entirely wrong. Flaubert knew they were not entirely wrong. He simply thought they were missing the point. His defence of the novel was precise and interesting. He argued that the slight unreality of Salammbô was not a failure of execution, but a deliberate condition of the work. The ancient world is inaccessible to us. We cannot actually know what it felt like to stand in a Carthaginian temple in 240 BC, what the air smelled like, what the religious feeling was, what fear meant in that context. Any novelist who pretended otherwise was lying. Salammbô was meant to feel slightly out of reach because antiquity is slightly out of reach. The distance built into the prose was a kind of honesty. He was not writing historical fiction in the comfortable sense where the past is made to feel cosy and comprehensible. He was writing about the opacity of the past, using the most sensory language available to owe him to gesture towards something that language could not fully reach. Whether readers accepted this argument depended largely on what they wanted from a novel. Those who wanted psychological immersion found Salammbô cold and theatrical. Those who were willing to take it on its own terms found it extraordinary, a sustained act of historical imagination that used maximalism as method rather than as excess. Flaubert himself moved between irritation at his critics and a characteristic unwillingness to explain himself further than he already had. He had written what he meant to write. The objections were the objections of people who wanted a different book. The publication in 1862 went better than the critical ambivalence might suggest. The novel sold well. The spectacle and violence drew readers who had perhaps not followed the more austere reputation of Bovary. It was argued about in the press, debated at dinner tables, found its defenders among writers who understood what Flaubert was attempting. Success for him had always been a complicated word. He cared about quality in a way that made commercial reception feel almost beside the point, but by any practical measure. Salammbô reached an audience and held it. What the novel revealed, for anyone watching Flaubert's career as a whole, was that his method was not dependent on subject matter. The same obsessive research, the same insistence on earned specificity, the same refusal to take shortcuts with language. These applied whether he was writing about a Norman housewife or a Carthaginian siege. The register could change completely. The discipline didn't. Salammbô was published in 1862 and sold well, and was argued about extensively. Flaubert accepted both the praise and the criticism with the same slightly contemptuous calm. This was because he had already started thinking about an entirely different kind of book. By the early 1860s, Flaubert had become exactly the kind of famous writer he had no particular interest in being, recognizable at the Paris salons he attended reluctantly, admired by exactly the people he was most suspicious of, celebrated for a novel he had nearly killed himself writing. The fame had come from Madame Bovary, and it had a particular quality he found difficult to tolerate. People wanted to meet the man who had scandalized France. They wanted to see the monster the prosecutor had described in court. What they found instead was a large, somewhat bearish Norman who spoke in opinions and preferred Croisset to Paris, and would rather spend an evening talking about sentence rhythm than about anything else. This was not what they had expected. It rarely stopped them from inviting him again. The Paris literary world of the 1860s had its own geography. There were salons, there were dinners, there were the Sunday gatherings where writers and critics collected around whoever happened to be ascendant that season. Flaubert moved through this world without quite belonging to it. He came to Paris for stretches, attended what he felt he had to attend, then returned to the Seine and the White Study and the work. Victor Hugo was there, enormous and inescapable. Sainte-Beuve, the great critic whose opinion still moved markets. Baudelaire, who had been prosecuted in the same year as Flaubert, and with whom he shared a certain bitter solidarity. The Goncourt brothers, Edmond and Jules, who wrote everything down in their diary with the meticulous pleasure of men cataloguing specimens. Flaubert. RT appears in those pages regularly. The booming laugh, the sudden ferocity about some literary question, the equally sudden melancholy. Then in 1863, something shifted. George Sand published a review of Salammbô that was generous in a way Flaubert hadn't expected from her. She was the most famous woman writer in France, possibly in Europe. She believed in literature as something that should reach toward the reader, offer warmth, provide something that could reasonably be called comfort. Flaubert did not believe this. He believed literature should be precise and true and formally rigorous. If readers found comfort in that, they had misread it. These were not compatible positions. They wrote to each other anyway. The correspondence that followed lasted until Sand's death in 1876 and ran to hundreds of letters. It is one of the stranger literary friendships on record. Sand called him her old troubadour. He called her his dear master. That he meant sincerely, and which coming from Flaubert was not a small thing. She was older than him by 17 years and had seen enough of life to find his aestheticism slightly adolescent, though she was too fond of him to say so in those terms. He found her faith in literature's consoling power sentimental, though he was too fond of her to press the point relentlessly. They argued about it anyway. The argument never ended. Neither of them wanted it to. What the friendship gave Flaubert was someone who took his seriousness seriously, without sharing all his conclusions. Most of his correspondents either agreed with him or were cowed by him. Sand pushed back. She told him he worked in too much isolation, that he needed the world more than he admitted, that the coldness he pursued in his prose was partly a defense against something he didn't want to feel. He disagreed. He wrote her long letters explaining why he disagreed. This was, in its own way, exactly what he needed. Ivan Turgenev arrived in the same period and became, in different terms, equally important. The Russian was 5 years older than Flaubert, famous across Europe for the sportsman's sketches and for fathers and sons. He understood Flaubert's commitment to craft in a way that required no explanation. They recognized each other immediately. Turgenev thought Flaubert was the finest prose stylist working anywhere. Flaubert thought Turgenev was the one foreign novelist who had truly understood what the novel could do. They met at the Paris dinners, they corresponded, they talked about sentences for hours with the mutual absorption of two people who have found the only other person who cares about the same obscure and important thing. The young Guy de Maupassant was a different kind of presence. He came to Flaubert's in the early 1870s, the nephew of Alfred Le Poitvin, Flaubert's dead friend, carrying manuscripts and ambition. Flaubert received him. He read the work and found it promising and told him it wasn't ready. He made Maupassant wait and observe and revise. The mentorship was exacting in a way that only someone who believed what Flaubert believed about the sentence could have devised. It would bear results, but that was still ahead. Through all of this, through the dinners and the letters and the friendships and the slow accumulation of literary prestige, Flaubert was working. He had been working since 1864 on a novel he described as the moral history of his generation. 7 years of it. The subject was a young man adrift in Paris, in love with a woman he could never have, moving passively through the upheavals of 1848 without being changed by any of them. It was, in ways he understood very well, a portrait of everything he had felt and failed to do when he was young. The research was immense, the drafts multiplied, the work cost him in ways that didn't show until later. When the novel came out and the reception turned cold, and he had to sit with the knowledge that 7 years had produced something most readers found formless and inert, Sand believed that literature should console, and Flaubert believed it should simply be true. They argued about this pleasantly, and at length for years without either of them changing their minds. That is about the best outcome a literary friendship can hope for. Sentimental Education took 7 years to write and was misunderstood almost immediately upon publication in 1869. That Flaubert found predictable and infuriating in approximately equal measure. He had started the novel in 1862, immediately after Salammbô. He had described its ambition clearly in a letter written 2 years into the work. He wanted to write the moral history of his generation. Not a political history, not a chronicle of events, the history of their feelings. How a generation of young men had come of age full of romantic energy and idealism, had watched a revolution arrive and collapse and transform into an empire, had ended up having accomplished essentially nothing. It was a portrait of passive failure on a generational scale, and Flaubert intended every word of it. The novel follows Frédéric Moreau, a young man from the provinces who arrives in Paris with vague ambitions and immediately falls in love with an older married woman named Marie Arnoux. He will love her for the rest of the book. He will do almost nothing about it. Frédéric drifts through Paris, through money inherited and spent, through friendships and minor affairs and half-started careers, through the revolution of 1848 and the coup that followed it. At the end of the novel, he is older and has nothing to show for any of it. The woman he loved is gone. The revolution he witnessed changed nothing. His life has passed. Anyone who has spent time with Flaubert's biography will recognise where Frédéric's central obsession came from. Marie Arnoux was Elisa Schlesinger, the woman Flaubert had encountered on a beach in Tréville in 1836. The married woman, 11 years his senior, whose presence had opened a wound that never fully healed. He had already written about her in Mémoires d'un fou at 16. He had written around her, through her, obliquely at her, for 3 decades. Now he placed her at the centre of his longest and most ambitious novel, and let the whole story of his generation accumulate around that unresolved feeling. What made the novel strange and what made the critics uncomfortable was its structure, or rather, its apparent lack of one. Madame Bovary had a clear arc, a building pressure, an inevitable end. Sentimental Education refused that kind of shape. Events accumulated without climaxing. The Revolution of 1848, one of the great upheavals of the 19th century, arrived in the novel almost sideways. Frederick watches the barricades go up. He moves through the edges of history, and then history subsides, and he goes back to being Frederick, and nothing has changed. The critics found this formless. They expected the events to matter in the way events are supposed to matter in novels, as turning points, as catalysts, as forces that transform characters into different versions of themselves. In Sentimental Education, they didn't. The novel just kept moving, flat and steady. Like the river Flaubert had watched from his study window at Croisset for the past 2 decades. The initial reception was genuinely disappointing. Critics who had celebrated Madame Bovary and Salammbô found the new novel inert. Some found it too long. Some found Frederick too passive to sustain interest across hundreds of pages. They were not entirely wrong about the passivity. They were wrong about what it meant. Frederick's passivity was the subject, not the failure. Flaubert had spent 7 years constructing a novel in which a character's inability to act was rendered with the same precision and attention that other novelists gave to their heroes' great decisions and bold choices. That was the point. The gap between romantic feeling and actual life was not a flaw in Frederick's story. It was the story. The flat, slightly depthless quality of the narration was also deliberate. Flaubert used his free, indirect style here differently than he had in Bovary. Emma's interiority was vivid, even hallucinatory at moments. Frederick's is strangely muted, seen from a distance, described in prose that observes his emotions the way a scientist observes a specimen. You feel the years passing. You feel the slow erosion of possibility. That effect did not come naturally. It was constructed, sentence by sentence, out of Flaubert's absolute control over what the prose was allowed to do and not do. How does a writer make time itself the subject of a novel? That was the question Sentimental Education was actually answering. It took the better part of a century for readers to see it. Proust saw it. James saw it. Kafka, reading the novel in German translation, understood immediately what Flaubert had been attempting. These were writers who were themselves trying to find forms adequate to the way experience actually unfolds, rather than the way narrative convention insisted it should. They recognized in Flaubert a predecessor who had gotten there first and been punished for it by readers who were not yet ready. The famous final scene of the novel only confirmed what ran through the whole of it. Frederick and his oldest friend, Delorier, sit together in late middle age and look back at their lives. They share a memory of a visit, as young men, to a brothel they were too nervous to enter. That memory, they agree, was the best time they ever had. Not the revolution, not the loves, the friendships, the ambitions, the moment when they stood outside something and did not go in. It is a devastating ending, quiet as everything in the novel is quiet. It is the logical conclusion of 300,000 words of a man failing to cross any of the thresholds life placed before him. The ghost of Elisa runs through all of it. The reunion scene near the end of the novel, when Frederick and Marie Arnoux meet again after years apart, and she offers herself to him, and he does not take what she offers, contains more understanding of Flaubert's own long silence toward the real Elisa than anything he ever said directly. He would not tell the actual Elisa Schlesinger what she had meant to him until years after the novel was published, when she was already widowed and old. The fiction arrived before the confession. In Flaubert's life, it usually did. It took several decades and a generation of modernists to recognize what Flaubert had actually done in that novel, which was to find a form for the experience of time itself. The slow way it moves past people who are not quite paying attention, taking everything with it. In 1870, Prussian soldiers were quartered in Flaubert's study at Croisset, sleeping in the room where he had written Madame Bovary. He had hidden his manuscripts in the garden. This seemed to him like a reasonable summary of everything that had gone wrong. Sentimental Education had been published the previous year to a reception that baffled and wounded him. Now, France itself was coming apart. The Second Empire collapsed in September 1870. Napoleon III surrendered to the Prussians at Sedan. The war that followed brought enemy troops deep into Normandy. Flaubert watched soldiers move through Croisset with a horror that was not simply personal. He had spent his entire adult life constructing a private world of manuscripts and discipline and solitude. Now strangers were sleeping in it. The soldiers left eventually. The damage to the study was not catastrophic, but something about the violations stayed with him in a way that mere physical damage could not have produced. The Commune of 1871 appalled him in a different register. He had no sympathy for the Prussians and no sympathy either for the radical violence that swept Paris in the months after the armistice. He watched the Commune's uprising and its bloody suppression with the revulsion of a man who had always distrusted political enthusiasm in any form. His letters from this period are full of disgust. Not the clean disgust of a principled position, but the sicker disgust of someone who has watched a civilization prove exactly what he suspected it was capable of. The political world had always seemed to Flaubert a machine for generating bêtises. 1870 and 1871 were its proof. Then his mother died. Flaubert's mother, Anne-Justine Caroline Flaubert, had shared Croisset with him since 1846, since the deaths of his father and his sister that had driven him there in the first place. She was the last person who had been present for all of it, the long years of Madame Bovary. The Eastern Journey, the trial, Salammbô, Sentimental Education. She died in April 1872. He was 50 years old, and he had lost within the span of a few years. The book's reception he had expected, the France he had known, the woman who had kept the house around him while he wrote. Croisset did not feel like a sanctuary after that. It felt like a large and expensive silence. What happened next was characteristically Flaubertien in the worst possible sense. His niece Caroline, the infant daughter of his dead sister. The child he had helped raise at Croisset had married a man named Ernest Comenville. Comenville was a timber merchant, and by the mid-1870s his business was failing badly. The debts were serious enough to threaten financial ruin for the entire family. Flaubert, who had always treated money as something that existed in order to support the writing, who had lived off his inheritance with the serene confidence of a man who never quite calculated whether it would last, looked at the figures and did what he did. He liquidated most of what remained of his inheritance to cover Comenville's debts. It was not a difficult decision in the sense that I'd not debate it at length. It was simply what one did for family, but the consequences were severe and lasting. He was left nearly destitute. The word is not quite right. He was not starving. Croisset was not immediately sold, but the financial cushion that had made his entire way of life possible was gone. He could no longer sustain the independence that had always felt to him like a precondition for serious work. His friends intervened. Ivan Turgenev, George Sand before her death, and others made quiet efforts. Eventually, through the efforts of his literary circle, a government appointment was arranged, a sinecure, a pension, a bureaucratic formality designed to give him income without requiring him to do anything. He accepted it. It cost him something to accept it. Flaubert had spent his life maintaining a contemptuous distance from official recognition, from the kind of institutional validate that he associated with mediocrity and compromise. Taking a government pension felt, to him, like a particular species of defeat. He was writing Bouvard and Pécuchet through all of this. The novel, his vast, exhausting project about two men who attempt to master all human knowledge and fail at every branch of it, required him to read thousands of books, to research chemistry and agriculture and medicine and literature and theology, all in order to depict his characters misunderstanding those same subjects. It was the most demanding project he had ever undertaken. He was pursuing it in a house that his niece now partly controlled, with failing health, with finances that required constant, anxious attention, without the mother who had always ensured that the coffee was ready and the household ran. Whether the novel was going to be a masterpiece or a magnificent wreck was a question he could no longer answer. By the mid-1870s, Flaubert had lost his mother, lost most of his inheritance to save his niece's husband from bankruptcy, accepted a government pension he found deeply humiliating, was writing a vast satirical novel about human stupidity in a house he could no longer quite afford. George Sand spent years trying to convince Flaubert to write something that offered readers a little warmth, along with all the precision. She died in June 1876, before she could read Un cœur simple, that Flaubert had started writing shortly after her death, and which is, among other things, the story of a simple-hearted woman whose devotion the narrative never once mocks. Whether he would have admitted this connection openly is another matter. Flaubert was not the kind of man who liked to explain himself. He was even less the kind who liked to admit that anyone had changed him. But he had been corresponding with Sand for more than a decade. Her death hit him hard. He wrote that he felt he had lost a friend he could not replace. Within weeks, he was at his desk working on a story about a servant woman named Félicité, who spends her entire life giving herself to others and receives almost nothing back. The timing is not incidental. The circumstances around these stories matter. By 1875, Flaubert was exhausted and financially precarious, and deep inside the sprawling wreckage of Bouvard and Pécuchet, a book he believed in completely, and that was slowly draining him of everything. He had been reading hundreds of volumes just to write the early chapters. His health was unreliable. His niece's husband had nearly bankrupted the family. Flaubert had spent most of what he'd left to prevent complete ruin. He was not in a position, practically or emotionally, to keep sustaining that enormous project without a pause. The three tales were, among other things, a way of breathing, short works, contained, something he could finish. Un cœur simple is the first and most celebrated of them. Félicité is a Norman servant who works for the same provincial family for decades, who loves without calculation or demand, who outlives nearly everyone she's ever cared for. Her nephew dies at sea. Her mistress's children grow up and drift away. A parrot she is given, loves with the same uncomplicated intensity she is given to everything else, dies and is stuffed and placed on a shelf. And at the end of her life, as she is dying, she sees it, the stuffed bird, and in her fading vision, it becomes enormous and brilliant. She dies believing she's looking at the Holy Spirit. The story does not tell you whether this is delusional or transcendent. It simply shows you what she sees. This is what Sand had been asking for, in her way. Not sentimentality. Sand was too intelligent for that, and Flaubert too proud to produce it, but a recognition that ordinary devotion deserves to be looked at directly, without irony, without the cold authorial distance that characterized the Bovary method. What makes Un cœur simple remarkable is that Flaubert managed this without abandoning any of his principles. The prose is precise. The observation is exact. He does not editorialize. He does not tell you that Félicité is good or sad or admirable. He simply renders her life with complete attention. The effect is devastating in a way that is entirely different from Madame Bovary's devastation. Emma Bovary's tragedy comes from excess, from the gap between what she imagines and what is real. Félicité's comes from sufficiency. She asks for so little and receives even less. The narrative holds this fact without flinching and without comment. The second tale, La Légende de Saint-Julien l'Hospitalier, is something else entirely. Flaubert had been drawn to the subject for years. He had first noticed a stained glass window depicting the legend of Saint-Julien in the Rouen Cathedral as a young man. He had never quite let it go. The story is a medieval legend, brutal and strange. Julien is born to noble parents who are told conflicting prophecies about his fate. He grows up to be a ferocious hunter, capable of remarkable violence against animals. One day, in a kind of bloodlust he cannot explain, he slaughters a herd of deer. A dying stag curses him. He will one day kill his own father and mother. He flees. Decades pass. He becomes a wandering soldier, then a hermit by a river, ferrying travellers across the water in penance for his sins. A hideous leper demands to be carried across and then held for warmth. Julian holds him, and the leper becomes Christ, and Julian ascends. It is a story about violence and redemption, and what penance actually costs. Flaubert tells it in a prose style that is deliberately archaic, shaped to feel like the medieval source it is drawing from. Herodias, the third tale, is set in the time of Herod Antipas and the execution of John the Baptist. Flaubert had been absorbed in the ancient and biblical world since his eastern journey decades earlier. The story moves through a single day, dense with political manoeuvring and religious tension, culminating in the famous dance of Salome and the severed head of Iokanaan delivered on a platter. It is the most external of the three tales, the most public, the most concerned with power and spectacle. Where Un Cœur Simple is intimate and still, Herodias is crowded and loud. What connects all three is compression. Flaubert had spent his career writing novels that took years to produce, and thousands of pages of drafts to arrive at their final form. These stories demonstrated that the same principles, exact observation, precise language, the author's absolute self-removal from the moral machinery of the narrative, could operate at the smallest possible scale. There is nothing loose in any of them. Every sentence is doing something. The economy is almost violent. The three stories were published together in 1877. They were immediately recognized as perfect. That gave Flaubert a brief and characteristic pleasure before he returned to the vast, unfinishable project that was slowly consuming his final years. For the last decade of his life, Flaubert was writing a novel that required him to read thousands of books in order to accurately portray two mediocre men reading those same books and understanding almost nothing, which is either the most efficient literary method ever devised or the least. The novel was Bouvard and Pécuchet, and the premise was simple enough. Two Parisian copy clerks meet by chance on a park bench, discover they share a surname initial, become friends, and then unexpectedly inherit a fortune. They retire to the Norman countryside. They decide to educate themselves. What follows is a comprehensive record of failure across virtually every field of human knowledge. They attempt farming, they attempt chemistry, they attempt medicine, then geology, then archaeology, then history, then literature, then politics, then religion, then philosophy. They fail at all of it. Not dramatically, not even interestingly. They fail in the flat, methodical way that people fail when they are certain they understand something they don't. Flaubert had been nursing the idea for decades. He'd originally called it Les Deux Cloportes, the two woodlicer, and the title tells you something about the affection he did not feel for his protagonists. These were not sympathetic failures, they were specimens. What Flaubert was after had a French name, bêtise. The word is usually translated as stupidity, but that's not quite right. Bêtise is something more specific. It's the stupidity of the confident, the idiocy that doesn't know its idiocy, the received idea held with absolute conviction by the person who absorbed it from somewhere else and has never once examined it. Flaubert had been cataloguing bêtises his entire adult life. He'd kept a notebook called the Dictionnaire des idées reçues, the Dictionary of Received Ideas, a collector, ion of the commonplaces, clichés, and automatic opinions that constituted the mental furniture of the French bourgeoisie. He had planned it as an appendix to Bouvard and Pécuchet. It was a demolition project. The novel was the laboratory, and bêtise was what he was dissecting. The method required was extraordinary and probably ruinous. For each chapter, Flaubert had to read everything his characters would read, and read it carefully enough to know precisely how they would misread it. Farming required him to work through agricultural manuals, scientific treatises on soil composition, and practical guides to livestock that he found almost physically painful to absorb. Chemistry required chemistry. Geology required geology. He is reported to have said that he needed to have read the equivalent of 100 volumes to write each chapter, and there's no particular reason to doubt him. His notes for the novel ran to thousands of pages. The research was not background, it was the structure. He had to know the field well enough to represent, with perfect accuracy, what it looked like from the outside, seen by two men who had approached it with enthusiasm and left it with nothing. This is worth sitting with. Flaubert spent years becoming genuinely knowledgeable about subjects he despised, in the service of a portrait of two men who became superficially knowledgeable about those same subjects and thought they had mastered them. The irony was not lost on him. He complained about it in his letters with a kind of savage humour. The book was eating his life, and he knew it, and he kept reading anyway. What he was building toward was something larger than satire. The Dictionary of Received Ideas was part of it, that catalogue of the automatic thought that passes for opinion, where every cliché about every subject is dutifully recorded not to refute it, but simply to display it, naked and airless on the page. But Bouvard and Pécuchet themselves were not just targets. They were also something like tragic figures, though Flaubert would have resisted that word. They wanted to understand the world. The wanting was genuine. The failure was not personal. It was structural. No amount of reading could deliver what they were looking for, because what they were looking for was certainty, and certainty was exactly what genuine knowledge tended to dissolve. The exhaustion of the project deepened through the 1870s. Flaubert was aging. He was in poor health. He was nearly broke, working in a house that circumstances had diminished, on a book that kept expanding. He had been writing it through the deaths of friends, through financial catastrophe, through the Franco-Prussian War, through his mother's death, through the gradual narrowing of his world. He worked on it at night, alone, at the desk at Croisset, the way he had always worked. The novel grew larger. The chapters multiplied. The research demanded more. He told his correspondents he thought it might be his masterpiece. He also told them he wasn't sure he would live to finish it. Whether Bouvard and Pécuchet would have been a masterpiece in its completed form is one of those questions literary history refuses to answer cleanly. What exists is remarkable, funny in a cold, exhausted way, precise in its rendering of intellectual pretension, structurally strange in a manner that feels deliberately unsettling. The two men at the centre of it are not exactly ridiculous and not exactly sympathetic. They are relentlessly, mercilessly human. They keep trying. The trying never becomes wisdom. The novel simply accumulates the evidence and refuses to deliver a verdict, which is as Flaubertian an ending as any he ever wrote. He died before he could finish it, which may be the most appropriate ending Bouvard and Pécuchet could have had. A book about the futility of human intellectual ambition, left unfinished by a man who had spent his entire life in pursuit of an impossible perfection. The thing that made Flaubert Flaubert, the thing that drove him to spend a week on a single page and 5 years on a single novel, was a belief about the sentence that went deeper than craft and closer to religion. He called it le mot juste, the right word, not a good word, not a close word, not the word that most writers would have chosen and most readers would have accepted. The exact word, the only word, the one that made the sentence do precisely what a sentence needed to do. This sounds like a reasonable standard until you realise what it cost. He worked in the white study at Croisset through the night, sometimes emerging at dawn, having produced one page he could tolerate. A single page. He described the process once in a letter to Louise Colet. His throat aching, his head reeling, having turned a single sentence over in 100,000 different ways before it finally settled into something he could live with. Not something he was happy with. something he could live with. He had a practice he called the gueuloir, literally the shouting place. He would stand in his study and read his sentences aloud at full volume, listening for anything that caught, anything that stumbled, any syllable that created the wrong weight or broke the wrong rhythm. The sentence had to pass through the body before it passed onto the page. It had to survive being spoken. Prose, for Flaubert, was not a looser and more permissive form than poetry. It was subject to the same demands. He believed this completely, and the belief isolated him, because almost no one else believed it in the same way. Where did this come from? The early writings are instructive. The Flaubert of the late 1830s and early 1840s, the Flaubert of the private notebooks, and the manuscripts he showed no one, was a different kind of writer, emotional, expansive, romantic in the most overheated sense. The prose surged and shuddered. Feelings were stated rather than revealed. He was doing exactly what young writers with genuine talent typically do, which is write what moves them and then call the movement itself the achievement. He recognized this failure in himself before anyone else did. The discipline of his mature style wasn't simply something he developed. It was something he imposed, deliberately and with considerable violence, on an earlier tendency. Le mot juste was, among other things, a correction. A untrolled demolition of what he had once been. The philosophical foundation of this was a conviction about the relationship between the writer and the work. The author, Flaubert believed, should be present everywhere in a novel and visible nowhere. Like God in the universe, he said. The idea was absolute self-effacement. The writer's opinions, preferences, moral judgments, none of these should appear on the surface of the prose. The novel should present the world as it is, with the same impassive accuracy a surgeon brings to a dissection. He had grown up watching his father cut into bodies with calm professional attention, and the image stayed with him. Art was observation. Observation required distance. Distance required that the observer disappear. This gave him the free indirect style, the technical method that runs through Madame Bovary and Sentimental Education and makes them feel unlike anything that came before. Free indirect style means that the narrator slips inside a character's consciousness without announcing the transition, without quotation marks or he thought or she felt. The reader inhabits Emma Bovary's romantic delusions from the inside, experiencing them with the full force of her conviction, while something in the prose simultaneously keeps a slight, ironic distance from those same delusions. You feel what Emma feels, and you see what Emma cannot see, at the same moment, in the same sentence. This is extraordinarily difficult to sustain. It requires the author to be everywhere in the prose, shaping every perception, calibrating every irony, while appearing to have vanished completely. The tension in all of this was considerable, because Flaubert was not a man without opinions. He had opinions about everything, expressed them at high volume, held them with a ferocity that bordered on physical. His contempt for the bourgeoisie, for its complacency, its bad taste, its satisfaction with received ideas, was not a mild literary preference, it was visceral. He found the self-satisfied mediocrity of middle-class French life genuinely nauseating. He said so frequently in his letters, his notebooks, his conversations. He thought most people were foolish and most ideas were wrong and most sentences were bad, and he was not shy about any of this. And yet the novels don't moralize. That was the commandment he gave himself, and he held to it with a discipline that cost him. Emma Bovary is destroyed by romantic illusion, but the novel does not tell you that romantic illusion is wrong. It does not insert a wiser character to draw the lesson. It simply presents Emma with such precision and such completeness that the reader arrives at understanding alone, without being guided. The narrator does not editorialize. The narrator describes. Bouvard and Pécuchet stumble through every branch of human knowledge and fail at all of it, and the satire is savage, but Flaubert never steps forward to confirm that you are laughing at the right things. He stays invisible. How do you write 5,000 pages of drafts for a novel you believe must not contain your opinions, when your opinions are among the most forcefully held of your generation? How do you spend decades perfecting a technique designed to make you disappear from the work when disappearing from the work is the last thing your temperament naturally inclines you toward? You do it sentence by sentence, in a study above a river, shouting prose at the walls until it sounds right. You do it because you believe the sentence is worth it. You believe the sentence is everything. He believed the author should be nowhere visible in the text, and he was savage in his opinions about almost everything. And the energy required to hold those two facts in simultaneous tension was perhaps what the 5,000-page of drafts were actually for. When the young Guy de Maupassant first came to Flaubert in the early 1870s with manuscripts he was eager to publish, Flaubert read them, found them promising, told him to wait, that Maupassant did for 7 years. This may be the most useful thing any writer has ever done for another. Maupassant was the nephew of Alfred Le Poitevin, the philosophical friend whose pessimism had shaped Flaubert's early thinking and whose death in 1848 had left a permanent absence. There was already a connection, then, before the young man ever knocked on the door at Croisset. But Flaubert did not extend himself as a mentor out of sentiment. He extended himself because he recognized something in Maupassant worth the effort of serious instruction. The question was whether Maupassant could survive the instruction. The terms were not gentle. Flaubert told him to go out and look at a tree, any tree, one specific tree, until he could describe it in a way that distinguished it from every other tree in France. He told him to observe a shopkeeper, a coachman, a soldier, until he understood not just what the man looked like, but what made him different from every other man of that type in the world. The right word was not approximately right. It was exactly right, or it was wrong. There was nothing in between. What Flaubert was teaching Maupassant was the same discipline he had applied to himself for 30 years. Kill the adjective that does no work. Cut the sentence that says what the previous sentence already implied. Read your prose aloud and listen for where the rhythm collapses. These were not suggestions. They were the conditions under which literature became literature, rather than merely words arranged in the shape of a story. Maupassant absorbed all of this and waited. In 1880, he published Boule de Suif, the story that announced him fully formed to the French reading public. Flaubert read it and declared it a masterpiece. He was not wrong. Even Turgenev arrived in Flaubert's life through the Paris literary dinners of the 1860s. The two men recognized each other almost immediately as working from the same set of convictions. Turgenev was the Russian who had written Fathers and Sons with a precision and a formal restraint that set him apart from his contemporaries, in the same way Flaubert was set apart from his. They were both committed to observation over moralizing, to the exact detail over the rhetorical gesture. They both understood that the writer's job was not to tell the reader what to think about the characters, but to render the characters so completely that thinking became unavoidable. Turgenev admired Flaubert more than any other European writer of his generation. Flaubert returned the admiration without reservation, which was not something he did easily or often. Their correspondence and their friendship ran through the 1870s. Two aging men writing to each other about craft and about the difficulty of finishing large projects and about the state of European literature, with the frank authority of people who had each spent decades earning the right to an opinion. When Flaubert's financial situation worsened in the late 1870s, it was Turgenev who helped quietly arrange support from the Russian side. This was because the friendship was that kind as well as the literary kind. Henry James was watching all of this from a more careful distance. He attended the Paris literary gatherings where Flaubert presided, listened to the conversations, and was absorbing everything. He was younger, more reticent, not yet the figure he would become. But he understood what he was looking at. He saw in Flaubert a writer who had thought more rigorously about the formal problems of the novel than anyone before him, who had treated the question of point of view and narrative consciousness not as technical details but as the central moral questions of the art. James would spend decades working out the implications of what he had witnessed in those rooms. His own novels, The Portrait of a Lady, The Ambassadors, The Wings of the Dove, would demonstrate how far those implications could be extended. Flaubert himself resisted categories. Zola and the naturalists claimed him as a forefather, and he found this both flattering and annoying. He was not a naturalist. He did not believe that accumulating documentary detail was sufficient. He believed in selection, in arrangement, in the subordination of all observed fact to the demands of form and rhythm. The naturalists wanted to reproduce the world. Flaubert wanted to remake it in sentences that were better than anything the world actually contained. These were not the same project, and yet he was undeniably at the centre of something. The Sunday gatherings at his Paris apartment brought together Zola and the Goncourts, and Daudet and Turgenev. Maupassant would appear with new pages for him to read. The conversation was always about literature, not about who was publishing where or what the critics had said, but about what the novel could actually do and what was still preventing it from doing it. It was a serious world. Flaubert had made it serious perhaps more than any other single figure of his time. How does someone who spent most of his life in a house by a river in Normandy become a centre of gravity for an entire literary generation? Partly through the work itself, which was impossible to ignore once you had encountered it, partly through the letters, which circulated and were read and discussed, and partly through the example of a life organised entirely around the demands of craft, with nothing permitted to take priority. The writers who came to Croisset and the writers who merely knew his books understood that this was what total commitment to the form looked like. It was a model. It was also, clearly, a kind of punishment, but the model held. He would not live to see the full extent of what he had started, but Proust and Joyce and Woolf and Kafka were all, in different ways, writing books that could not have existed without Madame Bovary. Flaubert had been dead for decades by the time anyone said so clearly. By the late 1870s, Flaubert was fat and gouty, and nearly broke and famous in a way that brought him no comfort. He was writing Bouvard and Pécuchet at Croisset every night, with the dedication of a man who had simply never learned how to stop. The gout had been worsening for years. His legs swelled. Walking became difficult, then painful, then something he avoided when he could. The syphilis contracted in Beirut 3 decades earlier had left its own slow record on his body. Surfacing in symptoms he described to close friends with the same clinical detachment he applied to everything else. He had grown enormous, the bear-like physical mass that the Goncourt brothers would document in their diary, with the particular fascination of men watching someone become a monument in real time. Travel, which had never been natural to him, became nearly impossible. Croisset held him now, not just by habit and preference, but by physical necessity. The house on the Seine was the only place his body could manage. The house itself was aging. The study where he had written Madame Bovary, where he had shouted sentences at the walls to test their rhythm through the night, was showing its years. Repairs cost money he no longer had in any reliable quantity. The financial catastrophe of his niece Caroline's husband had stripped away most of what remained of the inheritance. The government pension he had accepted, reluctantly, humiliatingly, was not sufficient to replace what had been lost. He tracked his expenses with the anxious attention of a man who had spent his adult life refusing to think about money, and was now being forced to think about almost nothing else. He wrote to his niece about practical matters, bills, the cost of firewood, the condition of the roof, and the letters have a quality of exhausted obligation that is nothing like the furious aesthetic manifestos he had sent to Colet 30 years earlier. The relationship with Caroline was strained in ways neither of them fully acknowledged. He had given up most of his financial security to save her husband from ruin. This sacrifice had not resolved anything. The debts persisted. The anxiety persisted. Flaubert was left in a house he could barely maintain, working on a book that had no foreseeable end. Caroline visited. She managed his affairs when she could. There was genuine affection between them, but the financial reckoning had introduced something into the relationship that goodwill alone could not dissolve. He wrote to Turgenev throughout this period, with a candour he allowed himself, with almost no one else. The Russian understood what Flaubert was attempting with Bouvard and Pécuchet in a way that most of his French contemporaries did not. Flaubert's letters to him carry a mixture of exhaustion and stubborn conviction that is almost moving in its persistence. He described the research as monstrous, hundreds of volumes read to prepare each chapter, entire fields of human knowledge absorbed in order to be accurately misrepresented by two comic copy clerks. He kept doing it. The Goncourt brothers were watching all of this closely. Edmond and Jules de Goncourt had known Flaubert since the years of his literary prominence. Their diary, one of the great documents of French literary life in the second half of the 19th century, recorded him across this final period with a sharpness that is not unkind, but is entirely unsparing. They noted the physical bulk, the booming voice, the way he occupied whatever room he entered, not through any calculated effort, but simply through the force of his presence. They noted the opinions. That remained violent and detailed, and delivered as if there were no possibility of disagreement. And they noted the other thing, the depressions that came without warning, the sudden withdrawals into silence, the darkness that moved through him like weather. His letters to other friends from these years show the same oscillation. There are passages of defiant energy, pages about the direction of the novel, about what the next chapter would require, about the idiocy of critics who had misunderstood his intentions for 30 years. And then, in the same letters or the ones that follow, something drops away. He writes about loneliness with a directness that his earlier letters rarely permitted. Most of the people he had known longest were dead. George Sand was gone. His mother was gone. Alfred Le Poitevin, whose early friendship had shaped him, had been dead for decades. The Paris literary world continued, but it was increasingly populated by younger writers working in directions he viewed with suspicion. He was the old man at the centre of it, respected in a way that felt, at times, like a form of dismissal. What is remarkable about these years is the work itself. He did not slow down. He did not produce less. The drafts of Bouvard and Pécuchet accumulated on his desk with the same obsessive density as every manuscript that had preceded it. The man who had spent a week on a single page in 1852 was still spending the equivalent time on every sentence in 1879. In a cold house, with a body that hurt, with accounts that did not balance, there is no satisfying explanation for this kind of stubbornness. It is either an admirable fidelity to a life's conviction or a temperamental inability to do anything else. With Flaubert, it was probably both. The Goncourts recorded him in their diary during these years as someone who still filled a room. The huge laugh, the opinions delivered like verdicts, the sudden descents into something bleaker, a man who had become, without quite meaning to, the last monument of something that was already passing. On the morning of May 8th, 1880, Flaubert was found on the floor of his study at Croisset with Bouvard and Pécuchet open on the desk above him. He was dead, and he was 58 years old, and the book was unfinished. His servant found him. The details are spare and unglamorous, which would have suited Flaubert. There was no deathbed scene, no final utterance, no gathered circle of mourners. A cerebral hemorrhage, sudden and complete. He had been working the night before. He had very probably been reading. The manuscripts were on the desk, and the river was outside the window, and the house was quiet. Then it was over. The news moved through Paris quickly. Maupassant, who had spent years learning how to write under Flaubert's deliberate and demanding supervision, was devastated in a way that surprised people who knew how difficult the older man could be. He had not been an easy mentor. He had told Maupassant to wait, to observe, and to find the right word, and to kill the adjective, and to wait some more. But the grief was real. Turgenev, in Russia, received the news and wrote that he had lost one of his oldest friends, a man he considered the most serious writer in Europe. Zola, who had learned from Flaubert without ever quite becoming him, delivered a eulogy that acknowledged the distance Flaubert had kept from the naturalist movement, while insisting on his centrality to it. The literary world understood, awed in the immediate aftermath, that something had ended. What it had ended was harder to say. The funeral was modest. The house at Croisset remained for a time. His niece Caroline, for whom he had sacrificed most of what he owned in the years before his death, eventually sold the estate. The house was demolished. The study where he had written through the night for 30 years, the room overlooking the Seine, where Madame Bovary had been composed sentence by tortured sentence, the desk where Bouvard and Pécuchet sat unfinished, all of it gone. What the site became afterward is not the point. The point is that it went. Bouvard and Pécuchet appeared in 1881, published from the manuscript he left behind. It was incomplete. Whether it would ever have been complete is a question that occupied critics for the better part of a century, without resolution. Flaubert had said he needed to read the equivalent of 100 volumes to write each chapter. He had been doing this for a decade, and the book still didn't have an ending. The satire was enormous and precise and exhausting. An encyclopedic demolition of intellectual pretension carried out by a man who had read more than almost anyone alive. The two copy clerks at its centre failed at everything they tried. The novel failed to finish. There is an argument that this was the appropriate outcome. Flaubert would have rejected that argument as sentimental. The reassessment took time. In the years immediately after his death, Flaubert was recognised as important in the way that important writers are recognised when they are no longer alive to complicate the recognition. He was placed, filed, categorised, realist, French, 19th century, the author of Madame Bovary. This was accurate and almost entirely insufficient. What was harder to say in 1880, what became steadily more apparent over the following decades, was that the technical discoveries embedded in his fiction had not yet finished propagating. The free indirect style, the absolute effacement of the authorial voice, the conviction that prose rhythm was a moral as much as an aesthetic matter. These were not period techniques, they were the equipment of the next century. Henry James read Flaubert carefully and wrote about him extensively. Proust absorbed him and built something vast, partly from the method. Joyce understood what the impersonal narration could do and pushed it further. Kafka, working in a different language and a different register, was writing in a world that Madame Bovary had helped make possible without knowing it. None of these writers were simply imitating Flaubert. They were building on a foundation he had laid, some of them aware of the debt and some of them discovering it only after the structure was up. The novel as a serious form, as a place where the full weight of consciousness could be examined without the author inserting himself to explain what it meant. This was not a natural condition, it was an invention. Flaubert invented it largely alone, largely in a house on a river in Normandy, largely by shouting his sentences at the walls to hear whether the rhythms held. The letters remained, thousands of them, to Colet and Sand and Turgenev and his niece and his mother and everyone else he had written to across 40 years. They were, in aggregate, one of the most detailed records any writer had ever left of the actual experience of writing, the difficulty of it, the physical and psychological cost, the belief that sustained the effort, even when the effort seemed absurd. A man spending a week on a single page had written down what that week felt like. This turned out to be useful information. Henry James and Proust and Joyce would spend decades explaining what Flaubert had done, in terms Flaubert himself would have found alternately satisfying and irritating. The house at Croisset where he did it was demolished, and the novels remained,